All right, hello everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in to today's live streamed PEEC program. Tonight we have a live stream presentation called Hummingbirds of Bandelier National Monument. I'm Beth Courtwright, the Adventure Programs Manager at the Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEEC, located in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And I will be the moderator for tonight's talk. This virtual event is being brought to you by the Pajarito Environmental Education Center, or PEEC, which operates the Los Alamos Nature Center. The Nature Center is now open to the public, so check the PEEC website, that's peeknature.org, for our current hours and more live stream presentations like this one. And I do just want to give a quick shout out to our wonderful members and donors, our volunteers and our staff who have really made it possible for us to give presentations like this and have just been amazing supporters over the past year. Tonight, we're hearing from Lisa Roig and Bob Loy. Lisa and Bob are volunteer citizen scientists who have specialized training for banding hummingbirds. The hummingbird banding site at Bandelier National Monument has been active for about 6 years, and I'm proud to be amongst the volunteers working to gain more knowledge about our local hummingbirds. And without further ado, I'll pass this over to Lisa to begin their presentation.
Hi, everyone. This is Lisa, and I'm here with Bob. We're going to talk about the hummingbirds of Bandelier National Monument, and there's 3 parts to this talk. First, Bob's going to tell us about the different species that we see in Bandelier and some fun hummingbird facts. Then I'll talk about the monitoring program that we've been working on for the past 6 years. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about things that we can do to help with hummingbird conservation. So I'm going to pass it off to Bob now, and he'll start by telling us about the hummingbird species of Bandelier National Monument.
Okay, hi, my name is Bob Loy, and so for 5 of the 6 years of this project, I've been a volunteer. And then for the last 2 years, I've been an apprentice bander under Lisa as my mentor, and that continues today. So I get to do some color commentary, kind of share the fun facts about hummingbirds. So first of all, a lot of people are surprised to find out that hummingbirds only exist in the Americas, all right? It's only a bird here in the Western Hemisphere. About 30 million years ago, they disappeared from the Asian and the European continent, and no one to this day can really explain why. A lot of people are very surprised to find out that there are that many species of hummingbirds in the Americas. The majority of those existing in South and Central America. You may be surprised to find out how many are here in North America, or excuse me, which country has the most? That would be Ecuador with 163 species. All right, how many do you think are here in the US? And I'm sure you're answering this at home. All right, so there's 19 of those 19 species that occur in the United States. Only 8 of those come here to breed, and only one of those breeds east of the Mississippi, the ruby-throated hummingbird. All right, we get 4 species of hummingbirds here in Los Alamos. 2 of those come to breed, and 2 of those are migrant visitors. We'll talk about all those in just a second. A few more fun facts. Of course, it's the smallest warm-blooded creature, has the most rapid wing beat, anywhere from 12 per second to about 100 per second, has the largest heart and breast muscles in proportion to its body of any other animal. All right, one thing that's surprising is humans, our brain is about 2.5% of our total body weight, but a hummingbird, it's about 4%. So they're pretty smart little guys. A little about the topography. It's the smallest bird, so it has the fewest total feathers. It's very sexually dimorphic, except the juveniles. That just means that the males, of course, look much different than the females. All right, we all know about feather iridescence. Really what that is hummingbirds just have some tiny air bubbles that are trapped at the end of their feathers, and those reflect the sunlight. Similar to when you take a bubble bath, the bubbles reflect light often. All right. Now let's talk about the hummingbirds here in Bandelier. All right, this is the broadtail hummingbird. All right. You can see how sexually dimorphic the two species or the two are. All right, a few quick facts, and you can see their range. Many times you'll be outside and you hear that very loud trilling sound. You know it's a hummingbird, but you might not know what kind it is. Well, that's the broad-tailed male. He's the only one that makes the very loud trilling sound when he flies. They're the highest altitude breeder in the US, all right? Here in the Southern Rocky Mountains, up to 10,000 feet. They have a very promiscuous mating system. Hummingbirds in general tend to be deadbeat dads, which force the mothers to be the ultimate single mothers. The men do nothing except come together for 1 second for a quick kiss. After that, they don't build a nest, they don't guard the nest, they don't feed the young, and they don't protect the young. They do absolutely nothing. All right. And not just broad-tailed hummingbirds, but all 4 of the species we have here tend to prefer red flowers. And this behavior probably evolved because most insects like light-colored feathers. So hummingbirds figured that out, and they knew they could get a lot more nectar out of the darker and the red flowers. So they tend to feed a lot on red flowers. All right. And the broadtail likes to hover when feeding. He doesn't like to perch. All right, the next is the black-chinned hummingbird. All right, and that's the second of our 2 breeding hummingbirds here in Los Alamos. They have the broadest range of habitats of the hummingbirds in the United States. They breed at sea level and also high up in the mountains. Their mating ritual, if you're outside and you see a hummingbird making that U-shaped arc, that's what the black-chinned male does to attract females. And I forgot to mention that the broad-tailed hummingbird male, he'll dive about 100 feet straight up in the air and then dive straight down another 100 feet. So that's how you know that that's a broad-tailed male. All right, they're pretty unsocial. And that's all 4 of the species we have here. They only come together for mating. And now the visitors that we have, and you're usually only going to get these. You may get a vagrant in the spring, but we'll mainly get them on their way back in the fall after they've had a successful breeding season up north. The Rufus Hummingbird, a lot of people are familiar with this bird and its territoriality. All right, this bird is on patrol all the time, but it's good to remember that hummingbirds are 1 day from death. If they don't feed and feed a lot, they could die. The Rufus Hummingbird is the northernmost hummingbird breeder. All right, breeds all the way up into central Alaska. And in terms of migration and the size of body, the Rufus Hummingbird makes the longest migration. It goes from central Mexico all the way up into Canada, about 3,500 miles each way. So the females are slightly larger for the Rufus. They consume about 3 times their body weight per day. And like the others, they only interact for mating and migrating. And here's Calliope Hummingbird, named after Homer's muse. They're the smallest bird in continental North America. You see at the bottom, a weight equals a penny. So a penny weighs 2.5 grams, and a Calliope Hummingbird averages 2.5 grams. Despite their size, they're tough. They'll chase hawks if they come near their nest. And they tend to perch and forage closer to the ground than the other hummingbirds we have. All right, just a few more fun facts before we transition to Lisa for the deep thinking portion of this. Hummingbirds are the only bird that are preyed upon by an insect. So if you see a praying mantis on your feeder, I ask you to safely remove it from your feeder. If you would like, I encourage you to go to YouTube. It's quite horrifying, but there's no shortage of praying mantis versus hummingbird videos on YouTube. And I'll let you guys read this on your own. Just some little hummingbird trivia. And I really like the name, the Portuguese name for hummingbirds, which is to kiss the flower. All right.
Okay. All right, now let's talk a little bit about this monitoring program that we've been working on. I'll go over the methods that we're using and then some of the findings that we have to date. But we're kind of in the middle of the monitoring program. It's called the long-term monitoring program for a reason. To get at trends in population data, you need to do it for a number of years in order to get a sufficient amount of data to detect trends. Okay, so first we'll go over the objectives of why are we monitoring in the first place. We want to document the characteristics of hummingbird populations that breed within Bandelier National Monument. And as Bob just said, the breeding populations are the broadtail and the black chin. And we treat them differently than we treat the migrating birds because we can get some interesting information about the breeding populations, such as, well, we do want to know the timing of their migration and the timing of their breeding season, and when do the young birds fledge, about what time of year do they fledge. And then we also monitor them for some health parameters. When we're putting a band on them, we have them in the hand, so we can look for things like diseases and mites and things that have been noted in some hummingbird populations elsewhere, and we can see how the health of our local populations are holding up. And then we can also document some characteristics for the populations that migrate through. That would be the Rufus and the Calliope. But because we don't see them during their breeding time, it's a different sort of monitoring objective there. So we have a lot of information so far on those two objectives. Things that we're still working on are to assess the multi-year population trends of species that breed within Bandelier. And then another important part of this monitoring program is to contribute to some Northern Hemisphere population studies that are being conducted by an organization called the Hummingbird Monitoring Network. And we are closely allied with the Hummingbird Monitoring Network, and I will tell you a lot more about them as we go along. So first, let's talk about the methods that we use to monitor the birds. We use a technique called bird banding, where you attach a small bracelet to the bird, which has a unique number on it. But first we have to capture the birds. So we capture them in these traps. A lot of bird banding for songbirds is done using what they call mist nets. So the birds just fly into the nets as they're flying around in their habitat. But that doesn't work that well for hummingbirds. They tend to get snarled in the nets, and it's very stressful for them. So we use a different method. We capture them with what's called a Hall's trap, and it's a baited trap. And here you see one with the sides of the trap lifted, and then we have somebody monitoring the traps. When the birds land on the feeder, then the person watching the traps will drop it, and the bird is safely captured inside. Once they're captured, the trapper gently extracts them from the trap and puts them in a little mesh bag and brings them to the banding table. And then we give them their uniquely numbered bracelet. A lot of people, when they hear about banding hummingbirds, they want to know, well, how much does a hummingbird band weigh? Well, it's a 1,000th of a gram. And as Bob said, hummingbirds are about what, 3.5 grams?
On average.
On average, yes. And then even though these legs are very, very small, we do actually measure them by size. And there's about, for the hummingbirds that we have in Bandelier, we have about 5 different sizes that we can adjust depending on the species. And this is a type of activity that is highly regulated. You have to have special training, and you have to have permits from the federal government and the New Mexico government. And since we're banding in Bandelier, we also have a national park permit. Here's a picture of some of our special tools that we use to apply these bands. The arrow on the left-hand picture is pointing towards one of the bands, and we attach them with pliers that have a hole drilled in them. And that way, when we put the band on and close it, there's no way that it can squeeze the leg too tight. In fact, there's a space between the band and the leg. And we use the little tool. I'm going to use my cursor for a second. This little tool here is what we use to measure the leg, so that we know that we got the right size band before we even try to apply it. And on the right-hand side picture, you can see the band attached to the hummingbird's leg. Okay, what other data do we collect while we have them in the hand? We collect, well, of course, we want to know the date of the capture, and whether, a lot of times we capture birds that have been here before and they'll already have a band on them. We call that a recaptured bird. So we note down whether it's a new band that we're putting on or whether it's recapture. Of course, the next important thing to know is the band number, because the whole reason for putting on bands is so that you can uniquely identify individual birds. And so we want to, every time the bird is captured, we want to note its band number. Then we record the species and its age. With hummingbirds, it's very difficult to age them very precisely. We can usually tell whether they're hatchlings or juvenile birds, or sometimes we call those hatchier birds. Once they become adults, we can't tell much difference between a 2-year-old bird and a 6-year-old bird. So we just call an adult bird an after hatchier bird. Then we note the sex, and we take a lot of information about the plumage. This is because many hummingbirds look a lot alike, especially the females of different species, and the juveniles can be hard to tell apart. So we look at their plumage carefully in order to try to make sure that we know its age and its sex as precisely as we can. And then we note the length of the wing and the length of the bill, the amount of visible fat. This tells us something about their health and their success in feeding in this environment. Their gravid condition. Okay, gravid is a word that may not be familiar to everybody, but it means whether they're pregnant or not. Do they have an egg inside? Are they gestating an egg? And then we look at their molt condition. Are they molting? Most hummingbirds do all of their molting in the wintertime, and we don't see a lot of molt once they've come north to the United States. But sometimes we see a little bit of molt going on. And then we weigh them and get their mass. And then before they leave the banding table, we want to make sure that they get a good start, that they haven't been too traumatized by their time being banded and being measured. We try to do it as quickly as possible also, so that they don't get stressed out. And so before they leave the table, we actually give them the opportunity to feed so that they have a little bit of extra energy to get them on their way. So many of the banding protocols that I just described have been developed by this organization called the Hummingbird Monitoring Network. It's a 501c3 organization. It's been in existence since 2002, and it was started by a woman whose name is Dr. Susan Wethington and a couple of other researchers from the University of Arizona. The mission of the organization is stated here: helping hummingbirds survive, reproduce, and thrive. And since 2002, this organization has coordinated hummingbird monitoring sites across a lot of the Western states in the United States and also in Mexico. And all of these stations work together to try to increase our knowledge about hummingbird migration and hummingbird population numbers. If you want to learn more about the organization, the website is savehummingbirds.org. And since there's all of these monitoring sites across the Western US who are using the same protocols, we have certain standards that we try to uphold. The monitoring sessions are held every 2 weeks while hummingbirds are present. And in Bandelier, that means we band from May until September. Many of you who are birders know that we sometimes have hummingbirds in April and we sometimes have hummingbirds in October as well. But part of this program is to make sure that the monitoring itself does not interfere with the bird's safety and health. So we don't band when it's too cold. And usually in those months, we find that it's just too cold to safely band hummingbirds. The monitoring dates that we use are coordinated across all of the sites. And we have the same amount of effort at each site. And what that means is we start banding at sunrise on a banding day, and we go for 5 hours. And the only exception to that is if there's rain or some other weather event that stops the banding. Or last year we had an incident where we had to stop because of COVID restrictions. All of the methods for applying the bands and for doing the measurements are standardized. We want to minimize the stress on the birds, and we want to maximize the data quality and make sure that all of the stations are getting data that can be compared to one another. Some of the places where banding sites have been in existence or still are in existence are Arizona, California, Idaho, British Columbia, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Mexico. We are the only site that is in operation in New Mexico. And of course, the more monitoring sites that are using these protocols and getting comparable data, the more information we can get about the migration patterns and compare populations from one site to another. Oh, and on the left is a picture of Susan Wethington, who's the executive director of the Hummingbird Monitoring Network. Okay, so now I'm going to talk more specifically about our site here in Bandelier. The project was initiated by former Bandelier biologist Steve Fettig. He left in, I think, 2015. And since then, we've had great support from the park, continuing with Sarah Milligan, who's a biologist there, and also the superintendents. Everybody's been a big help to us in keeping up our permits and lending a hand with monitoring. And we hope that this data will actually be very useful for Bandelier in the long run, so that they can use it for when they're making management plans. For instance, if they know when the breeding season is for certain hummingbirds, then they'll know there's certain activities that they won't want to do during that period of time. The program is a collaborative research between Bandelier and the Hummingbird Monitoring Network and all of the citizen science volunteers who help out. We started out in August and September of 2015. Those were our very first monitoring sessions. And since then, we've done complete field seasons from May to September, starting in 2016 and it's going ongoing now. This is an all volunteer citizen science project. What that means is everybody who helps out at the site, including me and Bob, we're volunteers. And I believe that citizen science is one of the best ways that you can spend your time by contributing to a useful data set and being able to gather data that probably would be too expensive to gather otherwise. So the only costs that we really have are equipment, which we invested in at the very beginning with some help from Bandelier and some help from citizen scientists. And then last year we got the Dorothy Horde Award from the Friends of Bandelier, which helped us to update some things and purchase some additional equipment that we had been doing without. Okay, so this slide shows the dates that are coordinated among the different Hummingbird Monitoring Network stations. And I want you to pay kind of a good attention to this because I'm going to use this information in some of the upcoming slides. The sessions are all numbered, and they when each station has a range of dates with where they can monitor within each session. We always band on Saturdays within the date range. So our Bandolier monitoring occurs between session 9 and session 17. The only exception to that was that when we were first starting out, we tried to band in session 18 in 2015. We determined that it was too cold then to band safely, so we cut it shorter the following year. And then we tried to band earlier in 2016, found the same thing, too cold. So in some of the slides, I'm going to be showing you some graphs where we have the different sessions listed across the horizontal axis. And so session 9 is our beginning session. It's usually in the middle of May. And session 17 is our last session. It's usually early to mid-September. And we'll go over that again when we get to those slides. Okay, so let's look at some results. First, we're going to look at the species that breed within Bandolier, the broadtails and the black chins. Some of the things that we've found from the data so far, we've gotten a good handle on the timing of their migration, when their breeding seasons are, what the return rate for birds that visit our site are, and the longevity of recaptured hummingbirds. Okay, here's one of those graphs I was telling you about. Along the bottom horizontal axis is the monitoring session. So over here, number 8 is at the beginning of May, and that's the one where we, that's the one where we banded only in 1 year and then decided the next year it was too cold. And on the far right is session 18, which is in late September. Again, we only banded there 1 year and decided it was too cold. So normally we go from session 9 to session 17. And what this graph is indicating is the total number of broadtails that we captured and banded at each session. And each line, each of the different colored lines represents a different year. So in general, what you can tell from this is that we generally band somewhere between 10 and 40 broadtail hummingbirds at each session. And I'm going to talk about the line for 2020 here in just a second. But I need to make a caveat here that we do not capture and band every bird that enters the trap. And the reason for that is to safely band hummingbirds, we can't do them all. I can't band that fast. So there's a limit of how many birds we can band at each session based on how many the bander can band safely. However, in 2020, we banded many more than in the other years, and that was because that was the year that Bob began banding at a separate table independently. He had progressed in his skills enough that I felt comfortable for him to do that. And so when we did that, we were able to process many, many more birds. And that's a good thing. And that's why you see that we banded at our peak day in 2020, we banded over 60 broadtail hummingbirds. Okay, we can also look at this data in a little bit more fine-grained way. This is a chart showing the different banding dates in 2020. And each of the different colors represents whether it was an adult male broadtail hummingbird, an adult female, a juvenile male, or a juvenile female. And over on the left, like May 17th, you can see that all we had was adult male and adult females, which is what you would expect because these are the birds that are flying in, they're getting ready to nest. And so on the left-hand side of the graph, we see that we have an abundance of adult birds. As we go towards the right-hand side, we begin to get juvenile birds. So this is important for those of you who are birders, because when you're out birding in the spring and all the way up until the end of June, and you see a hummingbird that you want to identify, it's probably an adult because the juveniles haven't hatched yet. And the females and the juveniles can look a lot alike, but you can be pretty sure in the spring, if you see a bird that looks like a female, it is a female. As you get into July and August, this becomes more difficult because the juvenile birds can look an awful lot like the females. So that's when identifying them by age gets a little more tricky. One more thing before I leave this slide is that we have this kind of information for every year that we've banded. And so we can also coordinate the age set, what I call the age sex distribution of the birds to some things like storms and weather and other things that might have been happening during that year. And so if I compare this chart to the same type of chart for another year, I might see a slightly different pattern. And then I need to think about, well, what was the weather event or something that happened during that year that caused the distribution to change? Okay, here's another graph that shows the monitoring sessions numbered from 8 to 18 across the bottom. And what I'm trying to show here is the number of birds that we captured that were gravid. They were gestating an egg. And you can see for broadtails that session 8, which is at the very beginning of May, that one year we actually did capture a broadtail female who was already gestating, already gravid. But it's session 10, which is the late May, early June, is when we have the peak of breeding season. And then as we go on towards the middle of the summer, you're not going to see too many birds that are gravid. And this is because they need to have time to hatch the egg and grow the bird big enough to get out of the nest, and for the birds to learn to fly so that they can migrate down to Mexico. So they don't want to start their breeding too late. They have a very short time schedule. This graph, again, has the same time distribution across the x-axis. And what I'm showing is the number of juvenile birds as a percentage of the total birds captured. So around the middle of the graph, session 13, that's the middle of July, we start to see juvenile birds as part of the, as a fraction of the birds that we banned. But towards later in the season, almost all of the birds that we see are going to be juvenile birds. Some of them are the ones that hatched here, and some of them are ones that are migrating down from places where they bred further north. Okay, one of the other pieces of information that we can glean from the information that we get is when birds are recaptured, we ban them and then we recapture them later at another date. We can tell how old they are, but it matters whether we banded them first as adults or whether we banded them as juveniles. If we banded them as an adult, let's say in 2016, then we can only say if we recaptured them in 2017, well, they were at least a year old in 2016, and in 2017 they were at least 2 years old. So we know their minimum age, but they could be much older. That's all we can tell from that data. So on the left-hand side, I show that from birds that we recaptured, we banded at our site, and then we recaptured again in a later year, that we have 63 male broadtail birds who have been recaptured. And the oldest ones that we saw were 5 years old. We had 155 female birds that have been recaptured at some later year. 8 of them are at least 5 years old. And so the longer we band, the more we'll know about the longevity of these birds. On the right-hand side, we have birds that were banded first as juveniles. And when we band them as juveniles, we can then tell exactly how old they are if we recapture them in a later year. And you can see that we've had a few juveniles that were born at Bandelier and then they returned and were recaptured. Okay, I have some similar graphs for the black-chinned hummingbirds that we looked at before. One thing to note, this is the graph that shows the total number of black chins that we captured at each monitoring session. One thing you might notice is that the total number of black chins is always less than the total number that we had of broadtails. Broadtails are definitely the dominant species at the site that we're using. But we do get plenty of black chins. And I think that they in general leave the site a little bit earlier, and that's why their numbers drop off towards the end of the season. Here we again have fine-grained analysis of the data from 2020, where we're looking at the age sex distribution of the black-chin hummingbirds. In the spring, again, we have adults, adult females and adult males. And then after the middle of July, we start to get juvenile males, juvenile females, and almost all of the adult males have left. The adult males usually leave, start their migration south earlier than the females and the juveniles. Okay, here is the graph that shows how many gravid females, how many black-chin gravid females we captured at each session. And again, it's at the beginning of the season. We get lots of gravid females, but they have to get those eggs hatched and they get the birds well enough so that they can make their migration. So it falls off at around session 12, which is at the end of June. And the number of juveniles as a percentage of number of birds that we capture increases as the season goes on. And yeah, so that basically has a similar pattern to the broadtail hummingbirds. Okay, once again, looking at longevity of black-chin recaptures. The black-chin females actually seem to be coming back almost every year. Some of them, we see the same birds and they are often gravid. So that's a really solid piece of information to have about site fidelity for these birds and their devotion to coming to Bandelier. The oldest birds that we've seen are at least 6 years old. We don't see as many of the juveniles returning, but that may just be something that we need to keep monitoring for. Okay, so those were the two species that that breed in Bandelier. We don't have quite as much information about the species that migrate through, but we can get some information. Here's a graph showing the total number of Rufus hummingbirds that we captured at each monitoring session. And you can see that the pattern is quite different from the two previous species. They don't even show up until session 12, which is right at the beginning of July. And then we have the peak of the Rufus hummingbirds coming at around the middle of August. Once again, we can look at the fine-grained data. It's in the case of these migratory birds, it's much more jumbled. We see the males usually come first, the adult males, but quite quickly we start seeing females and juveniles because they have a long way to go. So they're just on their migration route and they're all mixed together. But towards the end of the season, it's almost all juveniles. And this graph is again the percentage of juveniles captured at each session, and it goes up towards the end of the season. So what can we tell about recaptured birds of Rufus species? Well, there's only been one Rufus hummingbird that's been recaptured that had a band on it since we started monitoring. It was an adult female that was captured in 2017 in August. And it was first banded in Oliver, British Columbia earlier that year. Well, that is a very, one data point is pretty small, but it's a very solid piece of information. That bird was seen in Oliver, British Columbia, and then we saw it later that summer in Bandelier. So we know that that's a flyway for some Rufus hummingbirds. And that was a very exciting day when we saw that bird. Okay, so now I'm moving on to Calliope hummingbirds. Very similar situation to the Rufuses. They show up later in the season. This is the total number captured at each monitoring session. But if you look on the left-hand axis, you'll see that the total number of Calliopes that we see is much smaller. The maximum we ever had was 7 at one monitoring session. And again, fine-grained analysis. Number of juveniles captured is always more towards the end of the season. Okay, how many Calliope recaptures have we had? None. We've never seen a Calliope that's been banded at another station or had one return that we banded. So that's sort of a summary of the type of information that we've already gleaned from this data, but there's a lot more we can learn from it as we go on. We're working on the long-term population trends for the breeding populations. We would like to do a correlation study of breeding success and correlate that with the weather data that we have. The flyways of recaptured banded hummingbirds, this is one of the main reasons that people band birds at all, is so if you band a bird in one place and it's captured in another place, or if somebody finds a bird that died for some reason and it has a band on it, then they can send that information into the bird banding laboratory at the federal government runs and find out where the bird was banded. And that, like I said before, that's a really solid piece of information that you can't get any other way. Okay, and then all of this data that we collect from all the different hummingbird monitoring network sites is sent to the Hummingbird Monitoring Network, and they are conducting population trend studies across all of the different sites. And that's a pretty exciting endeavor. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about hummingbird conservation. And the number one thing that we can do to help hummingbirds survive is to improve the nectar landscape. We disrupt the nectar landscape in many ways because of roads and development and the use of herbicides and things like that. So there is an opportunity to help hummingbirds by protecting the nectar landscape along the migration routes. And we can do this on a very small scale by planting things in our own yards. In particular, native plants are good because that is what the hummingbirds are used to. They're looking for patches of native nectar plants that they can rely on to be there from one year to the next. Hummingbirds have a great memory for nectar patches, and they'll come back to the same ones every year. So if you're going to plant some hummingbird plants in your yard, check with local nurseries and see if you can up the number of native plants that you have and the number of hummingbird attracting flowers. One place that would be a great start would be come to PEEC and look at the gardens here. There's an incredible penstemon garden here that attracts hummingbirds like crazy. We'll give you lots of ideas. When in your garden, you want to have a continuous buffet of nectar producing flowers. And what I mean by that is that have some things that bloom in the spring, some that bloom in the summer, and some that bloom in the fall. We also want to encourage you to eschew pesticides and herbicides, because those things can be concentrated in the nectar of the plants and they can actually be harmful to hummingbirds. And yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory. And the other thing to make sure that you're attracting hummingbirds and giving them lots of opportunity to feed is to provide water and shelter. They like to feed in places where they can quickly dart away to some hiding place in case there's any danger present. And especially in this area, they will be very attracted to water. They need water. In addition to, they get most of their liquid through the nectar, but they like to bathe, and sometimes they like to fly through moving water. And often around water, there's some bugs. They eat bugs as part of their diet to get some protein. So if you provide those extra things, that will enhance the habitat for the hummingbirds. Another thing that is going on in terms of improving the nectar landscape is that the Hummingbird Monitoring Network is starting some new initiatives. And a lot of these initiatives have to do with enhancing the nectar landscape along migration routes. Because of these new initiatives, that the Hummingbird Monitoring Network is changing its name, and it's going to now be called the Hummingbird Conservation Networks. And if you'd like to find out more about those programs that they're starting, and in particular, they're trying to work internationally with Mexico and other Central American countries so that the migration routes are continuous all the way from British Columbia all the way down to the wintering sites down in Central America. So check out their website at savehummingbirds.org. Okay, what about feeders? Feeders can be a good supplement for birds, especially during migration time. Usually what the birds do is they tank up and they put on they'll go to one spot that they know is a reliable food source, and they'll tank up and put on fat until they are sure they can make it to the next nectar source. And so we can help them out using feeders, but it does require some care and some commitment to use feeders properly. One thing is they need to be kept clean. The feeders can grow mold in them if they're not carefully cleaned. And often if you'll see a feeder where the nectar itself has gotten kind of cloudy, that usually indicates bacteria growing in it. So you want to keep them clean and continuously full throughout the season so that they're a very dependable food source for the birds. So whenever you see, if you're hanging a feeder in your yard, whenever you see that it's becoming cloudy or any mold is visible, you should remove that feeder, wash it, and replace it. What I do in my yard is keep an extra set of feeders so that I can fill them, go and replace them, bring the dirty ones in. And then if you don't have time to wash them right away, you can soak them and make it easier to wash later. But the birds don't have to wait. They have their new feeders already out there. The hummingbird feeders, especially during the height of migration, they may need daily maintenance. There's going to be a lot of birds coming through, and especially if this is a very dependable nectar source, they're going to use up all the nectar quickly. And so be sure that you can commit to washing and filling the feeders on a regular schedule. And if you're going to be on vacation, you probably want somebody to act as a feeder sitter. Let's talk about the optimal nectar recipe: 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. The reason this is optimal is because this mimics what many flowers produce. And the hummingbirds have developed, they've evolved to have a system that can process that type of nectar easily. If you put too much sugar in or you don't put enough sugar in, then it can be hard on their kidneys. So research has shown that 1 part sugar to 4 parts water is a very normal nectar recipe for hummingbirds. So if all of this seems like too much work, what you might rather do is to improve the nectar landscape in your yard by planting a native hummingbird garden. Because then when you go on vacation, the plants are still there. They're not going to need to be refilled, or they'll take care of that by themselves. Okay, and finally, there's lots of ways that you can contribute to hummingbird conservation through citizen science. And I've only listed a few ways right here, but there are many others out there. One of them, eBird, is run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And it's a way for birders to contribute to a database of bird sightings by submitting their checklists. And I think this is probably the biggest citizen science project in the world at this point. That it's yielding lots of great data for all kinds of birds, not just hummingbirds, but it's also helpful for tracking hummingbird sightings. There's another organization called Journey North, which is also tracking migration patterns. And then I've also mentioned hummingbird conservation networks before, and their website at savehummingbirds.org. You can also contribute to some local project, and that's like the project that we're working on now, by being a volunteer. And right now, I'd like to take a minute to say thank you to all of the volunteers who've helped over the years. There's been many of them, and many of them are very, very dedicated, and we couldn't do this project without them. So thank you to the volunteers, and I consider all of my volunteers to be citizen scientists. Okay, I believe at this point we can stop and take some questions.
All right, thank you so much, Lisa and Bob. We did have a couple questions come in on the chat, and for those of you that are still listening in, just keep typing them into the chat if you have a question that comes up, and I'll start reading through these now. So the first one is, have any hummingbirds banded here been captured elsewhere?
Good question. And the answer is no, to date. One of the reasons I think that may be is that we are one of the farthest east sites in the Hummingbird Monitoring Network. And it would be great to have a couple more sites in southern New Mexico and also in Mexico. The site that in Mexico has been kind of an on and off site. They haven't had the staff to completely keep it up for all the years of the Hummingbird Monitoring Network. But I imagine that many of our birds are flying a little further east than at the banding sites. So to date, no.
All right, the next one's kind of related. How many hummingbirds total have been banded at Bandelier?
I should have made sure I had that information before I came. It's somewhere in around 2,000.
Wow, that's amazing. 2,000 birds. All right. Are there native plants for hummingbirds that are deer resistant?
That is also an excellent question. I am not really an expert on hummingbird gardens. There's some great resources out there. And in fact, could probably do a whole other presentation on hummingbird gardens. But no, I don't have an answer to that. But I'm sure that there are some resources out there that we could look into.
Yeah, and actually some of our local plant stores might actually have more information might have some suggestions for that, like Petrie Garden Center and Metzger's. I do know that our penstemon guru volunteer here, Larry at PEEC, he knows which ones of his penstemons get eaten by deer, and he makes sure to protect those. All right, going on, let's see. Does homemade hummingbird food need to be boiled before you feed it?
So if you boil the syrup, what that does is it kills any bacteria that's in the water at the time when you make the nectar. And that can help it last a little bit longer in the feeders. However, sometimes the bacteria is introduced afterwards from the birds themselves, dipping their beaks into it. And so it may not actually help it last that much longer, because if you get a bird coming along who introduces a bacteria, and that can happen almost immediately, even if the water's been boiled. I personally do not boil my nectar, but I'm also changing my feeders at most twice. I mean, at least twice a week, and so I usually don't have a problem with bacteria growth.
All right, we had a few people chime in about the numbers and some plants. Phyllis says that mints and sages are also in the mint family, are good for hummingbirds, and deer do not eat them. Bee balm is another one as well. Bob saying he's seeing a lot of black chins daily in the western area, that he puts on feeder watch, but no broadtails. And then let's see, where's this next? Sorry, I'm trying to keep up with all the questions. What does a hummingbird shelter look like?
So hummingbirds, I mean, if they're nest building, they like a very dense foliage, so they can hide within it, and they'll find a fork in the tree or in the bush or whatever to build their nest. Or sometimes they build it on a branch that is extending underneath another branch, so that they have a little bit of shelter over them. Anyway, so for nest building, they want dense foliage. For hiding, almost anything that provides them a perch within a thicket that can exclude other larger predators.
All right. So this next one's maybe for Bob. Bob mentioned the air bubbles in the feathers that make the iridescence. I guess like this bird that's bathing in the center photo. How does the air stay in there?
I have no idea. I am sorry.
That's all right. We can look it up. All right. Oh, sorry, I got muted for a second. Another one about iridescence. Why are the Rufus different from the black chins and the broadtails? What makes the difference in color?
Well, the colors are different by species. That's the way they evolved. Of course, the males are the only ones that have that iridescent gorget. And just a fun fact, the word gorget, we had to figure out why a hummingbird's throat is called a gorget. But you may recall some of those photos of General Washington and the British Army from the time of the Revolution. And back then, the officers wore their rank on a necklace around their neck with a crescent shape, and that was called a gorget.
Awesome, thank you, Bob. All right, can you recommend resources for how to learn, to learn how to differentiate between females and juveniles of different species? It's very tough.
Yes, I mean, there are some great guides out there that have some either drawings or pictures of the identifying characteristics. a lot of times when they're just feeding, or if you're just looking through binoculars, it's going to be tough. However, if you're a good photographer and you take some photos, then you can actually look at some of the identifying characteristics, like the amount of rufous in the tail, and the amount of color on the flanks and things like that. And do you have the?
Yeah, well, a really good resource, and it's free for Android and for all the iPhone users. It's called Sibley's Hummingbirds. And what it does is it gives all the characteristics of the 19 species of hummingbirds that visit the United States. But what's great about this app, if you go to it, there's a comparison, and you can scroll down within 2 species at a time and compare juveniles to juveniles, let's say broad-tailed to black chins, and you can do it between male juveniles or female juveniles. So that's a free online or a free resource that's out there in the app world.
I am going to be downloading that as soon as we're done here. All right, other than the praying mantis that you showed, what are the other natural predators of hummingbirds?
So hummingbirds themselves don't have too many predators, but their nests are susceptible to being raided. And there's a very interesting paper that came out about how in certain places hummingbirds will build their nest in close proximity to a raptor's nest. And that's because the raptors won't bother with the hummingbirds. They're too small, I guess not a big enough fight. But the raptors keep some of the other birds away that would normally raid their nests, raid the hummingbird nests. So do you know of any other predators of hummingbirds?
I don't know of any other predators, but hummingbirds suffer the same threats that all birds do. And that's climate change, habitat loss, invasive species, and toxic pollution. So they face a lot of threats out there, beside praying mantises.
All right, so Bob Walker chimed in on the chat to help us out with the gorget colors. He says gorget colors are not caused by pigments. Rather, they are caused by regular spacing of cellular structures that refract light of very specific colors. So
well, that's well put for a theoretical chemist. I'm very
there we go. Thank you so much, Bob, for helping us out.
And I would like to mention at this point that all of the beautiful photos that are in this slideshow of hummingbirds come from Bob Walker. He is a fantastic photographer, and I wouldn't have any good pictures to show without him.
Yes, thank you so much, Bob.
And,
for
Keegan Tranquillo just wrote us that hummingbirds can be trapped in some spider webs.
Ooh, okay, that was a predator I was not thinking of.
Yes.
Right, which is also interesting because hummingbirds, a lot of their nests are made out of spiderweb material because they want to have a stretchy nest so that the little birds can push it around as they grow. So I guess they have to expose themselves to these vicious spiders at times.
Yes, that is a dangerous nest building material collecting process, apparently. All right, that looks like maybe all of the questions from the chat. Please, anybody chime in if I missed them. There were a lot all at once, so please chat me again if I skipped anything. And but we're just after 8 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And Lisa and Bob, I want to say thank you so much again for sharing just this incredible community science, citizen science research with us. Let me double check. There's lots of thank yous and great job coming in on the chat. So thank you again, Lisa. Awesome job. Bob, thank you so much.
Thank you all for listening.